Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. As the days tick down until the summer break, that is when we're expecting Max Verstappen to make a decision as to whether he's going to stay at Red Bull for the upcoming year or try and join Mercedes if Toto Wolff will have him. This decision depends, it seems, in large part, not just on what happens over the next couple of weekends, but also what the engine program is looking like for Red Bull going into 2026 and beyond. Max may be taking his time to get all the information he can before making that big decision, we think, in the coming weeks, and the latest rumours has it, as of today, that it's not looking especially rosy for Red Bull powertrains. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. Let's begin with Spa because it's meant to rain. UK, Northern France, Belgium over the next few days. Of course, we're not hoping for a repeat of 2021. I'll show you guys the updated forecast here in a second for the Grand Prix weekends. It's also worthy to say though, we have Belgium, then we have Hungary, then it's the summer break, and then shortly after that we go to Zandvoort. The penultimate ever Dutch Grand Prix. Well, not necessarily, it might be back at some point, but we know that Zandvoort's contract, I think they have a Grand Prix next year in 26, and after that it's done for certainly the time being. They presumably were outbid by some of the other counterparts that also want Grand Prix, and the race has been pretty entertaining here over the last few years. It's a pretty good track, but they have some issues with the circuit today, and well, the issues are as follows. So there was a flood basically at the track, and this is a live look, presumably not live, but you know what I'm saying, at the track. So you guys can tell this is the banked final corner of the circuit when they kind of come back through the dunes. I'm assuming that's where this is anyway. And well, as you can see, it looks like there's a bit of a problem here, right? On the inside of the circuit, the storm has presumably damaged this bit, and it's, well, I mean, the track is cooked, right? I mean, you can't race on that, I would imagine. This is actually the original post here, so this is the image showing what looks like a big crack in the track, really. But I don't know if it just kind of looks like that, and actually the track is fine, it's just cracked here. This is a video of it, though. I'm watching this for the first time with you guys. But anyway, the Dutch Grand Prix organisers have said that actually, it's fine, and nothing to worry about. It's all going ahead as planned. So this obviously is further up the banking, but I mean, yeah, you can see by the flooding, and I mean, yeah, there's a big crack in kind of the track, although maybe not technically the track, and that runs up all the way to the top. So I mean, look, whatever you say, it's pretty concerning. You wouldn't necessarily want to run a Grand Prix there right now. The organisers say there's no damage to the circuit, there's no crack in the tarmac, that's fake news, and there's, the events are still running as normal, basically. I think they had some F1 Academy stuff going on there as well, so kind of confused what the actual reality is there, but I'm sure that in a few weeks of Formula 1 it's probably going to be fine, but just worthy to point out, especially because, well, rain is one of the topics of today. This is the forecast for the circuit Spa-Francorchamps, so it's technically in Francorchamps more than it's in Spa, but whatever. So anyway, let's just have a look at what things look like, because it's not as dramatic as it looked a couple of days ago. I think for Spa, especially after what happened in 21, there's always concerns about what the weekend's weather is going to look like. Now, on Thursday, because of course in Spa, because they know this is an issue, the drainage of that circuit is probably the best of any track near enough on the planet. They design the track and the way that they run it and all the equipment they have for draining the water when necessary. And it may not be so necessary, or it may be. So on Thursday, currently, initially the whole week looked like it was going to rain, light rain every day. Now it's saying on Thursday, we're looking at thunderstorms, potentially pretty heavy rain. It's definitely going to rain Thursday, based on what we see here. Friday, it may rain, 20%, 30% chance it might, especially in the evening, it may rain. And it could affect some of the running. It's probably not going to be too dramatic. Saturday now looks far less likely. So during the main part of the day for, of course, it'll be the sprint and then main qualifying later in the day, unlikely to be so affected. And then Sunday, it's yet again looking pretty likely that there's going to be some rain. So it could be a really fascinating weekend, because if it's raining every day, obviously that's problematic, but, you put on a wet setup and you run that for the weekends. We know now that there is the opportunity to change setups after the sprint. So after free practice on Friday, you set your car up for sprint qualifying. You then do sprint quali, maybe in some light rain. You then do the sprint on the Saturday morning, potentially in the dry, and then you get the chance to set up your car again. Potentially, if the race is going to be wet on the Sunday, then you might want to set it up differently to how you did Friday night. So it definitely raises some questions here, and it's going to be a fascinating weekend if that's what we see. The other question for you guys really is, how will Lando Norris get on? It's not historically his best track at Spa. Piastri tends to like this circuit more and should be favoured probably to win this weekend. But in the wet so far this season, despite questions about Lando's ability in those conditions and his ability to execute under pressure and whatever, he's actually pretty much dominated the wet this year. At least this year, right? Last year there were some question moments, but this year, won in Australia impressively, managed the conditions better than Piastri did. I mean, look, they both slid off the track, but Lando saved it, Oscar didn't, and that was obviously a big moment of the championship. The Miami Sprint and then Silverstone, where he won as well. And if you look at the wet race championship, I mean, it's Norris miles ahead of anybody else, and then it goes Verstappen, Piastri, Hulkenberg, Russell, Hamilton, which is pretty remarkable, really. Obviously, Hulkenberg massively impacted by the result at Silverstone, but still pretty interesting. Even Stroll's here at 18 points. You've got to respect it. So it's just interesting to see that Norris is miles ahead, technically, when it comes to wet races that we have had so far this season. I would probably expect that to change this weekend, although, I'm certainly expecting Norris to still be strong. I think he is probably slightly underrated in wet conditions. I think he's very proficient in them. It's not his best track. So I think that raises some big questions. We know that Max was at Spa in 2016 when he finished outside of the points. It hasn't happened since then, and we'll get back to Max in a second. Just before we do, a couple of things to say on Ferrari and on McLaren. So Ferrari have an upgrade this weekend. It's their new rear suspension. We've talked about it for ages. Is it going to work? Is it going to help the guys? That's the big question. Takeru and the guys at AutoRacer put out an article, and as always, I'll leave it linked in the description box below. Just one little snippet I thought was interesting. So back in Silverstone, they were struggling with the setup of the car. They run quite an extreme setup, and for Leclerc, the setup that they ran to get the car to actually turn into the corners, which they struggle with, meant that it was terrible in the rain, and issues with lift coast once again emerged, and Leclerc basically said it's an absolute nightmare for him to try and do that. So it seems like that the settings that they use has an inadequate percentage of braking on the rear, and that's needed to keep the car stationary on the turn-in. The problem is that it then heats up the rear tyres more easily because they slide a bit more, and it puts a bit more of a strain on the fronts. As a result, or in addition to this, they've got to close the brake ducts because of this issue, and therefore it leads to temperature issues, which leads to the lift and coast. So it's all like a catalogue of issues, really, that Ferrari suffer with, and they tested the new rear suspension and see if it would improve this, and that's probably one of the reasons why they did it at super hot, difficult conditions at Mugello. And they found that there were no issues. The drivers didn't complain about the braking, but they've obviously got to match that up in reality with the proper tyres. So that's just another quick takeaway from the filming day that they did at basically the test they did at Mugello the other day, is that they weren't troubling about the brakes. The car maybe didn't feel massively different, so that's what we saw yesterday, but the braking issues may have been resolved, and that's a key thing, because if the braking issues is now fine with this, let's say, wider window of setup that Ferrari may now be able to adopt, it puts them in a much friendlier position for setting up their car for particular circuits. We know that around places like Monaco and, of course, at Monza, they will be strong. But other tracks and making the car consistently competitive has been a major challenge for Ferrari, and more often than not this season, they've fallen on the wrong end of that spectrum. Ferrari are cautiously optimistic, therefore, about this change, but I think they still very well recognise that McLaren may be a very long way down the road this weekend, and if it rains, that's probably not good for Ferrari. And that's the issue, really, is that typically you might say, okay, well, if it rains, it gives opportunities, let's say levels the playing field or whatever, right? It's all about the driver. And to some degree, that's kind of true. I do think it's a bit of a myth. The car definitely still matters in wet conditions, and some might argue it matters more because if it generates more downforce, that becomes even more critical. But obviously the feel and everything, the driver becomes more relevant as well. The point is that the Ferrari and the Mercedes just don't seem really good in wet conditions. Not to say that Hamilton, Leclerc's wet weather prowess is questionable at best, but, Hamilton, Russell, even Antonelli from his junior days, exceptional wet weather drivers, and yet we didn't see that over the wet weather races we've had so far this season, really. And it seems that at least a substantial amount of that is to do with the characteristics of the car. And that's the issue if you're one of those teams. It's like, well, when there's a wet race, you would love that to be your opportunity to beat the McLarens. And yet, sometimes it actually seems to go the other way. So that's the problem right now that these guys are suffering with, at least in part. Charles Leclerc had a few interesting words because he knows Ferrari inside and out, and he says it's been very interesting to see the areas where we are working differently compared to a team like Mercedes, which had huge success in the past, and compare this way of working. I'm sure that will help us to take steps forward in the future. There's always been a very interesting feedback. There's already been very interesting feedback from Lewis because for me the feeling in the car is normal, but it opens your mind to different working techniques. Maybe part of that is to do with the power steering, that Hamilton got in the car for the first time and said, what are you guys playing out with this? Like, it's not a good idea. So there's a few things that Hamilton will say. The question, of course, is whether Ferrari will listen, right? Now, this is the McLaren piece. If you guys are unfamiliar, they brought a front suspension change quite a few rounds ago now. Oscar didn't decide to elect to choose it, whereas Lando did. And the change has been credited, at least to some degree, with Lando's increasing confidence, I would say, in that car. And I think even Lando has said something to this effect as well. Piastri, though, didn't elect to go for it. Now, is it better? Is it just revised? That probably depends on the driver, because if it was substantially better, Piastri would use it. But he did say that he preferred not to use it because then he has fewer variables to consider when it comes to evaluating future upgrades, which I thought was a pretty interesting assessment. I might change at some point. Like I've said a few times, it's not an upgrade. If it was purely a benefit, then obviously I'd put it on a not ask questions. But whilst we have some actual upgrades coming along, I thought it was just best to have a clean read on those. I guess the idea being that they actually do have upgrades this weekend in Spa. There were some floor changes, and Piastri would like to have the car very consistent until the upgrades arrive, so you know what you're going to do. It does always raise questions then, right? Because let's say they slap the upgrade on Piastri's car and actually it doesn't work quite as well with that older, pre-revised front suspension, whereas it does for Lando, then it's a question as to what you do, or it could easily be the other way around. So this could be kind of critical in the championship fight here, because you never know, you bring an upgrade to the car, it may just integrate better with one of those options than the other. It may not, it may be the same. But if it does, then that could be a real deciding point in the swing in the championship potentially. And I don't imagine McLaren will have an opinion on that necessarily, but they may have an idea as to what it may favour over one of the others. So that's what Piastri says. Of course, every weekend at this point is massive in the context of the championship. And the question really is, can Max have any chance of getting back into it? And if the answer to that question you think is no, then it's all about Max Verstappen's future next year. I mean, as we know, even last year, there was an opportunity for Lando to potentially close the gap and win the championship. He was never really very close in the ends, and a lot of that was his own doing. Some of it was Verstappen taking, let's just say, action in such as Mexico and in Austin to make sure that Lando was not going to score any more points than he could allow to occur. Lando is also commenting on Red Bull because we know that under Christian Horner, they stretch the rules to the very limit. In every single domain, Horner Racing would push the boundaries in setup of the car, in the way that they approach things off the track, the way that they approach things on the track with their rivals, always putting in complaints and putting in suggestions to the FIA and appealing things and defending their drivers to the hilt regardless of what happens. You know, there was a very Horner Red Bull style approach, and I do wonder, I really wonder, with Horner gone and with Wheatley gone especially, whether Red Bull will feel anywhere near the same. I don't know if Red Bull will feel as ruthless an operation as they previously were. I mean, Red Bull were a hugely frustrating pain in the backside for many of the other teams, and I'm sure that's still to some degree true. But under Horner, that's the way that he led his team. They were talking about the water in the tyres and all this. They came up with all sorts of theories, presented them to the FIA, not even maybe believing that it was true, but just to get some clarifications so they could maybe understand where McLaren are actually finding the trickery, if there is any trickery at all. And that's how Red Bull operated, as kind of like the bad boy of Formula One, because it makes sense with their brand. I'm a bit of a tangent here, but it is my general feeling that Red Bull in recent years, since the passing of Mateschitz, have felt a little bit more corporate. And I'm not sure that Horner Racing really fit into that mentality. So I do wonder, I really wonder under McKees, whether Red Bull will start to feel like a substantially different outfit. Now, especially if Max leaves, I think that's almost certain to be true, because Max really fits that culture that they had, and Max isn't going to change. but he may leave, and that is the big debate as it stands. Now, he may leave on a couple of different grounds. Horner, we know, was not really best friends with Jos Verstappen. The Verstappen seemed relatively keen to get rid of Horner from the team. They felt like he was, trying to take on too much power and influencing the team more in his own vision than in anybody else's, and that may well be fair enough. I think Christian Horner certainly made some, not even maybe mistakes, because some of the decisions he made in hindsight he may feel like were worth making because it was worth the risk to try and take hold more power at the team. But after Marco stayed, I think it was inevitable that Horner had kind of lost the civil war and eventually was going to be executed, and that's what happened just a couple of weeks ago. Speaking of Marco, obviously Vettel's been talking about potentially coming in there, but the big debate that people have is really on 2026. Next year's cars are going to be dramatically different. The race are actually talking today about the next generation, how different they're going to be, whether it's going to be better or worse in certain regards, but we know that the aerodynamic regulations are going to be quite restrictive, right? Adrian Newey says that, well, there's more to it than meets the eye once you look at the details, but, they are going to be pretty prescriptive in terms of what you can design the cars to look like in 2026. Of course, teams are going to have their different options, but it is a feeling of many that certainly the engine is going to be a massively important component of next year's machines. And as a result, Horner's project, the Red Bull Powertrains project, is a very important component of that. And this, to me, is one of the key reasons why I think Max Verstappen is very much so taking his time on this decision. Now, even if Max decides to leave, is it guaranteed that he can just waltz into Mercedes? Not necessarily. There's a couple of angles to Max's decision, right? Because if he does leave and join another team now, then he runs the risk that actually Red Bull do kind of nail it next year, and also runs the risk of joining a team on a longer term contract that then don't become the best team next year. What if Mercedes mess up next year and McLaren are miles ahead, even with the Mercedes engine? Then Max has joined the wrong team. Maybe he should have just waited, especially if he signed a long-term deal that keeps him stuck down at Mercedes, because, Toto's certainly not going to sign a deal where Max could just walk away after a year. I'm sure there might be some performance clauses in place, but, Mercedes will be careful about stuff like that, especially if they're paying big money to buy him out of the team. So Max's decision is interesting. I would certainly lean, if I was Max, towards leaving though right now, but he doesn't have to make that decision quickly because Russell doesn't have a contract, right? I mean, David Coulthard is saying it's bizarre for a driver with the quality of Russell and arguably being the best, or certainly close to it, driver of the season so far, not under contract, and it doesn't seem like Toto's going to put him under contract anytime soon because he knows that this Max Verstappen situation is in the air. So there's not a major rush from the Max perspective to make this decision. He will have to make the decision probably in the next month, but he could have made it now. Maybe he already has, but I think the longer he waits on it, the more he gets to kind of see what Red Bull are looking like next season. And then again, today we get hit with another, interesting development that, according to rumours, Red Bull Ford's engine program is under some serious degree of doubt. I mean, lots of parties keep saying this, and every few days there's a bit more talk about it, that, well, Mercedes are sitting pretty, Ferrari aren't far behind, Honda maybe are back in the game, Audi are going to be nowhere, and then Red Bull Ford is, they're very much tight-lipped, Red Bull. You're not going to hear anything coming out of that camp, but there is a feeling that it's not exactly looking great, and that wouldn't be a surprise. Horner even said before he was sacked it would be embarrassing if Mercedes lost to them next year, which probably tells you what you need to know about the state of the project. Even Helmut Marko had to come out after Horner was sacked and say, I don't know what Horner was talking about there. Our engine project's fine. Don't know what Max is worried about. So you can see the politics at play. And I think the longer Max stays on, the longer he gets to be at the factory and see the progress and understand about where they're hitting targets, where they're missing targets, and get a real feeling as to whether Red Bull actually could be in the game next year or not. Because if they're not going to be in the game, and they're not going to be anywhere close to being in the game next year, then Max's decision is potentially made for him, despite the team trying to appease the Verstappens by kicking Horner out of the outfit. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final thing for you all. This is a pretty remarkable record. Every time Hamilton has finished at Spa, he has finished in the top four. He had an incredible streak of podiums when he did finish, a couple of P4s in there, and then of course famously won last year. But as we know, there was another great record of Hamilton's at Silverstone, and Ferrari brought that one to a close. So we'll see whether this happens again when they get to Spa. So very much interested in your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.